The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez wiped down the counter of the small coffee shop for what felt like the 100th time that day. The familiar smell of freshly ground beans and the gentle hum of the espresso machine had become the soundtrack of her civilian life, a far cry from the roar of jet engines and radio chatter that once defined her world. At 28, Sarah looked like any other barista in her simple black apron and ponytail. The customers who ordered their daily caffeine fixes had no idea that the woman handing them their lattes had once been Lieutenant Commander Sarah Ghost Martinez, one of the Navy's most skilled radar intercept officers. They saw only the friendly smile and the steady hands that never shook, even during the morning rush. The coffee shop sat just outside Miramar Naval Air Station in San Diego, strategically positioned to catch both military personnel heading to work and civilians starting their day. Sarah had chosen this location deliberately when she opened Wings and Beans 2 years ago. She wanted to stay close to the world she had left behind, even if she could never fully return to it. The bell above the door chimed as another customer entered. Sarah looked up from the register to see a young ensign she recognized from the base. He was new, probably fresh out of flight school, with that eager look that reminded her of herself years ago. "Good morning," Sarah said with her practiced smile. "What can I get you today?" "Large coffee, black," the ensign replied, then paused. "Hey, haven't I seen you around the base before? You look familiar." Sarah's smile never wavered, but something tightened in her chest. This happened sometimes. Military personnel would recognize something about her bearing, the way she carried herself, or perhaps catch a glimpse of the woman she used to be beneath the barista exterior. "I don't think so," she said easily, pouring his coffee. "That'll be $3.50. The ensign paid and left, but not before giving her another curious look. Sarah watched him through the window as he walked toward the base entrance, his stride confident and purposeful. She remembered that feeling, the sense of belonging to something bigger than herself, the pride that came with wearing the uniform. As the morning rush continued, Sarah fell into her familiar rhythm. Pour, steam, serve, smile, repeat. It was a simple life, and she had convinced herself it was enough. The nightmares came less frequently now, and she could sleep through most nights without waking in a cold sweat. The medication helped, and so did the routine of normal civilian work. Her therapist at the VA hospital had said that finding purpose in small things was important for recovery. "Not everyone can save the world," Dr. Chen had told her during one of their sessions. "Sometimes the most heroic thing is just showing up every day and choosing to keep going." Sarah understood the wisdom in those words, but some days she felt like she was sleepwalking through life. The coffee shop was successful enough to pay her bills and keep her busy, but it felt like she was watching her life from a distance, like an observer rather than a participant. Around 10:30, the morning rush began to subside. Sarah was restocking the pastry case when she heard the familiar sound of military vehicles pulling up outside. Through the window, she saw a convoy of black SUVs with government plates. Her pulse quickened involuntarily, a conditioned response she couldn't quite shake. The door chimed again, and several people in dress uniforms entered. Sarah's trained eye immediately cataloged them. 2 captains, a commander, and bringing up the rear, a woman wearing the stars of a rear admiral. The brass didn't usually stop at her little coffee shop. The group approached the counter, their conversation dying as they focused on the menu board. Sarah straightened her shoulders unconsciously, falling into a posture that any military person would recognize as attention, before catching herself and relaxing back into her civilian role. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "What can I get for you today?" The first captain ordered a cappuccino, the commander wanted an Americano, and the second captain asked for a latte. When it came to the Admiral, the older woman studied Sarah's face for a long moment before speaking. "I'll have a coffee, Black," Admiral Patricia Hayes said, her voice carrying the authority of decades in service. "And I believe we may have served together, Lieutenant Commander." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands, which had been steady moments before, began to tremble slightly as she reached for the coffee pot. The use of her former rank was like a physical blow, bringing back memories she had worked so hard to bury. "I think you have me confused with someone else, ma'am," Sarah managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a barista." Admiral Hayes's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained sharp and knowing. "Ghost, isn't it? That was your call sign." The coffee pot slipped from Sarah's suddenly nerveless fingers, crashing to the floor and sending hot coffee and ceramic shards across the tile. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet shop. The other customers looked up from their phones and newspapers, sensing the tension in the air. Sarah stared at the broken pieces at her feet, her breath coming in short gasps. She hadn't heard her call sign spoken aloud in over 2 years, not since the incident that had ended her career and changed everything. The word ghost hung in the air like an accusation, a reminder of who she used to be and what she had lost. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice shaking as she knelt to begin picking up the pieces. "I'm sorry. I'll clean this up right away." The other officers exchanged glances, clearly sensing something significant was happening but not understanding what. Admiral Hayes held up a hand to stop Sarah from cleaning up the mess. "Leave it," the Admiral said firmly. "We need to talk." Sarah looked up from the floor, pieces of broken ceramic still in her hands. The Admiral's face was serious but not unkind. Whatever this was about, it wasn't a social call. Military brass didn't just show up at coffee shops to reminisce about old times. "I can't," Sarah said, struggling to her feet. I'm not in the service anymore." "I know exactly why you left, Ghost," Admiral Hayes said quietly. "And I know what happened on that mission. What I need you to understand is that we never should have let you go." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 2 years, she had carried the weight of her last mission, the guilt and the shame that had driven her from the service she loved. She had been told that her decision to leave was for the best, that some things couldn't be undone, some trust couldn't be restored. "Ma'am, with respect, I think you need to review the files," Sarah said, finding some strength in her voice. "What happened out there, the call I made, people died because of my decision." Admiral Hayes shook her head slowly. "People lived because of your decision, Lieutenant Commander. It just took us 2 years to figure out why you were right and everyone else was wrong." The shop fell completely silent. Even the espresso machine seemed to have stopped its gentle humming. Sarah felt like the world had tilted sideways, like everything she thought she knew about her past was suddenly uncertain. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "The intelligence you questioned, the mission parameters you challenged," Admiral Hayes continued, her voice carrying across the quiet space. "You were right to trust your instincts. The information we were acting on was compromised. If you had followed orders that day, if you hadn't made the call to abort the strike, we would have hit a civilian shelter. 43 children, Ghost. You saved 43 children." Sarah felt her legs go weak. She gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. The mission that had haunted her dreams, the decision that had ended her career and driven her into exile, had been the right one all along. "But the briefing said—" Sarah started, then stopped. She remembered that day with crystal clarity. The intelligence reports, the satellite imagery, the certainty in the voices of her superiors, and her growing unease as something in the data didn't feel right. "The briefing was wrong," Admiral Hayes said simply, "based on intelligence that we now know was deliberately falsified by a double agent. You saw what others missed. Trusted your gut when the facts didn't add up. That's what made you one of our best officers." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 2 years of guilt beginning to lift from her shoulders. But with that relief came anger, sharp and hot. "Then why?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why was I forced out? Why did my commanding officer tell me I was unfit for service? Why have I spent 2 years thinking I was responsible for a catastrophic failure?" The other customers were definitely staring now, but Sarah no longer cared. The careful civilian facade she had maintained was cracking, revealing the officer underneath. Admiral Hayes glanced around the shop, clearly aware they had an audience. Because the truth was classified at a level that most people in that room didn't have clearance for. Because the investigation took 18 months to complete. And because sometimes, Lieutenant Commander, the Navy fails the very people who serve it best. The admission hung in the air like an accusation against the entire institution. Sarah had never expected to hear such words from someone wearing Admiral's stars. "We're here because we need you back," Admiral Hayes continued. "Not because we're doing you a favor, but because your country needs what you can do. There's a situation developing that requires someone with your specific skills and instincts." Sarah laughed bitterly. "My skills? You mean my ability to question orders and make the wrong people angry? I mean your ability to see patterns others miss, to trust your instincts when the data doesn't match reality, and to make the hard calls when lives are on the line," Admiral Hayes replied without hesitation. "The same abilities that saved those children 2 years ago." The shop was completely silent now. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. Sarah looked around at the faces watching her. Civilians who had no idea they were witnessing the resurrection of a military career that had been buried under classified secrets and institutional failure. She thought about her simple life serving coffee, the quiet routine that had helped her heal. She thought about the nightmares that still came sometimes, the weight of decisions she had carried alone. And she thought about 43 children who were alive because she had trusted her instincts over her orders. "What kind of situation?" Sarah asked finally. Admiral Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the shop. "The kind where someone needs to ask the right questions before it's too late. The kind where we need Ghost back." Sarah looked down at the broken coffee pot still scattered across the floor, the pieces of her civilian life lying in fragments. She had built this quiet existence as a refuge from the complexities and moral ambiguities of military service. But perhaps some people weren't meant for simple lives. "I'll need to close the shop for a few days," Sarah said quietly. "We'll take care of that," Admiral Hayes replied. "Pack light, Ghost. We're wheels up in 2 hours." As the group of officers filed out of the coffee shop, Sarah stood alone among the broken ceramic, feeling like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. Behind her lay 2 years of careful healing and simple routine. Ahead lay the unknown, a return to a world that had both betrayed and vindicated her. She looked around at her coffee shop one more time, this sanctuary she had built from the wreckage of her military career. The morning sun still streamed through the windows. But everything else had changed in the space of a few minutes. Sarah Martinez, barista and small business owner, began untying her apron. Lieutenant Commander Sarah "Ghost" Martinez was about to return to duty. The Pentagon felt exactly as Sarah remembered it, all polished corridors and purposeful footsteps echoing off marble floors. But walking through those halls again after 2 years felt like stepping into a life that belonged to someone else. The civilian clothes she wore seemed out of place among the sea of uniforms, marking her as an outsider in a world where she had once belonged completely. Admiral Hayes led her through a maze of corridors and security checkpoints, past offices filled with people making decisions that would affect lives around the globe. Sarah's military bearing returned automatically, her posture straightening and her pace matching the Admiral's confident stride. Some instincts never really disappeared, even after years of serving coffee instead of country. They stopped outside a door marked only with numbers and security classifications. Admiral Hayes placed her hand on a scanner and looked directly into a camera for retinal identification. The heavy door clicked open with a sound that Sarah recognized from her days in sensitive compartmented information facilities. "After you, Ghost," Admiral Hayes said, gesturing her inside. The briefing room was exactly what Sarah expected from a classified operation. No windows, walls lined with equipment designed to prevent electronic eavesdropping, and a massive screen dominating one end of the room. Several officers were already seated around a polished table, their folders closed and their faces carefully neutral. Sarah recognized the look of people handling information that could start wars or save lives. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Hayes announced as they entered, "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, call sign Ghost." The room stirred with interest. Sarah caught whispered conversations and sideways glances that told her these people knew who she was, or at least knew her reputation. Whether that reputation was positive or negative remained to be seen. A Navy captain stood and extended his hand. "Captain James Morrison, Intelligence Division. We've heard a lot about you, Commander." "It's just Sarah now," she replied, shaking his hand. "I'm not sure why I'm here, but Admiral Hayes seems to think you need someone to ask uncomfortable questions." Captain Morrison smiled grimly. "That's exactly what we need. Please, have a seat. What I'm about to show you is classified at the highest levels. Even being in this room means you're read into an operation that officially doesn't exist." Sarah took a seat at the table, feeling the weight of familiar responsibility settling on her shoulders. This was how it always started in the intelligence world, with briefings that began by telling you how secret the secrets were. The lights dimmed and the main screen came to life, displaying a satellite image of what looked like a remote industrial complex surrounded by desert. Sarah's trained eye immediately began cataloging details: the layout of buildings, the positioning of what looked like defensive structures, the roads leading in and out. "This facility is located in the Syrian desert, approximately 200 kilometers southeast of Damascus," Captain Morrison began. "On the surface, it appears to be a chemical processing plant owned by a legitimate petrochemical company. Our sources indicate it's actually a weapons development facility." Sarah studied the image, her analyst instincts kicking in. "What kind of weapons?" "Chemical," Admiral Hayes answered. "Specifically, a new type of nerve agent that's supposedly undetectable by current protective equipment. Intelligence suggests they're planning to test it within the next 72 hours. The screen changed to show intercepted communications, fragments of conversations in Arabic with English translations scrolling alongside. Sarah read through them quickly, her mind automatically sorting information and looking for patterns. "Who's your source?" she asked, a question that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. Captain Morrison exchanged a glance with Admiral Hayes before answering. "A defector from the Syrian chemical weapons program. He approached one of our assets in Lebanon 3 weeks ago, claiming he wanted to prevent a humanitarian disaster." Sarah felt a familiar chill run down her spine. The scenario was eerily similar to the one that had ended her career 2 years ago. A single source, dramatic claims about imminent threats, and pressure to act quickly before it was too late. "Have you verified his information through independent sources?" Sarah asked, knowing she was probably asking a question others in the room had already considered. "We've confirmed that the facility exists and that there has been increased activity there over the past month," Captain Morrison replied. "Satellite imagery shows new equipment being delivered, increased security patrols, and what appears to be preparation for some kind of test." Sarah nodded, continuing to study the intelligence summaries. "What does the defector want in return for this information?" "Asylum in the United States for himself and his family. Standard arrangement for this type of cooperation." "And what's the proposed response to this intelligence?" Admiral Hayes leaned forward. "A precision strike to destroy the facility before the weapon can be tested or deployed. Surgical, Minimal collateral damage, maximum effectiveness. Sarah felt her stomach clench. The parallels to her last mission were becoming impossible to ignore. A single source, pressure to act quickly, and a target that intelligence claimed was an imminent threat. Admiral, with respect, this sounds very similar to the situation in Yemen 2 years ago, Sarah said carefully. The room fell silent. Everyone present clearly knew about Yemen, about the mission that had ended Sarah's career and led to 18 months of investigation. "That's exactly why you're here, Ghost," Admiral Hayes said. "We need someone who isn't afraid to ask the hard questions, someone who will challenge the intelligence if something doesn't feel right." Sarah looked around the table at faces that ranged from supportive to skeptical. Some of these people probably thought bringing her in was a mistake, that her history of questioning orders made her unreliable. Others might see her as a necessary check against the kind of intelligence failure that had nearly led to catastrophe in Yemen. "I need to see everything," Sarah said finally. "Not just the sanitized briefing materials. I need to see the raw intelligence, the communications intercepts, the satellite imagery analysis. If you want me to validate this operation, I need access to the source material." Captain Morrison looked to Admiral Hayes, who nodded. "Done. You'll have full access to all relevant intelligence within the hour. I also want to talk to the people who debriefed the defector. I want to understand his motivations, his access to the information he's providing, and any potential reasons he might have for providing false information." "That can be arranged," Admiral Hayes said. "What else?" Sarah thought for a moment, remembering the mistakes that had been made in Yemen, the assumptions that had gone unchallenged until it was almost too late. "I want an independent assessment of the target. Send someone to confirm that the facility is what we think it is. I know that's risky and time-consuming, but if we're going to destroy something based on the word of a single source, we better be absolutely certain we have the right target." The request caused a stir in the room. Intelligence operations often moved faster than that, relying on analysis rather than direct observation. Sending someone to physically verify a target was expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. "Ghost, we have less than 72 hours, Captain Morrison protested. "If this intelligence is accurate, we may not have time for that level of verification." Sarah fixed him with a steady stare. "And if the intelligence is wrong, we may not have the luxury of fixing our mistakes afterward. In Yemen, we were acting on intelligence that seemed solid, from a source that appeared credible. We were hours away from hitting what we thought was a weapons cache. It turned out to be a civilian shelter." The reminder hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah could see some people in the room reconsidering their assumptions, while others looked uncomfortable with the suggestion that their intelligence might be flawed. "There's another problem," Sarah continued, studying the satellite images again. "The layout of this facility doesn't look right for chemical weapons production." She moved to the screen and pointed to specific buildings. "Chemical weapons manufacturing requires specialized ventilation systems, waste disposal facilities, and safety protocols that would be visible from satellite imagery. I see some of those elements, but not all of them. And the buildings that supposedly house the production equipment are too small for the kind of operation we're talking about." Captain Morrison frowned. "Our analysts concluded that the equipment could be housed in those structures." "Could be, yes. But if I were building a facility to manufacture nerve agents, I would design it differently. The security perimeter is wrong, too. It's designed to keep people out, but not to contain a chemical accident. If they were really working with the kind of agents our source describes, they would need different containment protocols." Sarah stepped back from the screen, aware that she was challenging the work of people who had spent weeks analyzing this intelligence. But that was exactly what Admiral Hayes had brought her here to do. "I'm not saying the intelligence is wrong," Sarah said carefully. "I'm saying it's incomplete. There are questions we need answers to before we commit to military action." Admiral Hayes studied the satellite images with new eyes, considering Sarah's observations. What do you recommend? Give me 24 hours to dig deeper into the intelligence. Let me talk to the people who handled the defector, review the communications intercepts with fresh eyes, and see if we can find independent confirmation of what we're being told. If this is a legitimate threat, 24 hours won't make the difference. If it's not, we could save ourselves from making a catastrophic mistake. The room erupted in quiet but intense discussion. Sarah could hear fragments of conversation about operational timelines, political pressure, and the risks of both action and inaction. She understood the tension. Military intelligence was always a balance between the need to act quickly and the need to act correctly. Admiral Hayes held up a hand for silence. Ghost, I brought you here because your instincts saved 43 children in Yemen. What are your instincts telling you about this situation? Sarah considered the question carefully. Her instincts had been right in Yemen, but they had also cost her career and 2 years of her life. Trusting them again felt like stepping off a cliff without knowing if there was a net below. My instincts tell me that something about this doesn't feel right, Sarah said finally. The timeline is too convenient, the intelligence is too neat, and the source has too much to gain from convincing us to act. It feels like Yemen, but I can't put my finger on exactly why. That's enough for me, Admiral Hayes said, standing up. 24 hours, Ghost. Find me the truth. As the meeting broke up and people began filing out of the room, Sarah remained seated, staring at the satellite images still displayed on the screen. She was back in the world of life and death decisions, classified intelligence, and moral ambiguity that came with military service. Captain Morrison approached her as the room emptied. Commander, I want you to know that not everyone in this building thinks bringing you back was a good idea. Your reputation for questioning orders precedes you. Sarah looked up at him, unsurprised by the admission. And what do you think, Captain? I think that if you're right about this, like you were right about Yemen, questioning orders might be exactly what we need, Morrison replied. The intelligence files will be delivered to your temporary office within the hour. And, Commander, I hope your instincts are wrong this time. After he left, Sarah found herself alone in the briefing room with Admiral Hayes. The older woman was studying the satellite images with the kind of intensity that comes from years of making decisions that affect thousands of lives. Having second thoughts about bringing me back? Sarah asked. Admiral Hayes smiled slightly. Having second thoughts about letting you go in the first place. The Navy needs people who aren't afraid to say the Emperor has no clothes, even when the Emperor outranks them. Even when those people cause problems for their commanding officers? Especially then, Admiral Hayes replied. Ghost, in Yemen you prevented a war crime. Yes, it caused problems for people who had invested in intelligence that turned out to be wrong. Yes, it embarrassed some people who should have asked better questions. But 43 children went home to their families because you trusted your instincts over your orders. Sarah felt the familiar weight of that responsibility, the knowledge that her decisions could save or cost lives. It was a burden she had tried to leave behind in her civilian life, but it seemed to have found her again. What if I'm wrong this time? Sarah asked. What if this facility really is developing chemical weapons and my caution costs lives? Admiral Hayes moved toward the door, then paused to look back. Then we'll deal with the consequences. But Ghost, I'd rather explain why we took too much time to get it right than why we acted too quickly and got it wrong. As Admiral Hayes left, Sarah remained alone with the satellite images and the weight of another decision that could change everything. She thought about her coffee shop, her quiet civilian life, and the simple problems that came with running a small business. Those problems seemed very far away now. She stood and walked closer to the screen, studying the images with the trained eye of someone who had spent years analyzing intelligence and learning to see beyond what others wanted her to see. Somewhere in these pixels and data points was the truth, and she had 24 hours to find it. Sarah spent the next 18 hours buried in intelligence files, satellite imagery, and communications intercepts. Her temporary office in the Pentagon's intelligence wing had become a maze of classified documents, computer screens, and coffee cups that reminded her of her other life running a coffee shop. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had traded serving coffee to civilians for consuming coffee while serving her country again. The deeper she dug into the intelligence, the more her unease grew. The pattern was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. But it was there. The communications intercepts were too perfect, the timing too convenient, and the defector's story too complete. In her experience, real intelligence was messy, incomplete, and often contradictory. This package was none of those things. At 3 in the morning, Sarah found what she was looking for buried in the metadata of a communications intercept. The timestamp showed the conversation had been recorded 6 hours before the defector had supposedly fled Syria. Either the Syrian chemical weapons program was using time travel, or someone was manufacturing evidence. She leaned back in her chair, feeling a familiar mix of vindication and dread. Her instincts had been right again, but being right meant that someone had gone to elaborate lengths to convince the United States to attack a target in Syria. The question was why. Sarah picked up the secure phone and dialed Admiral Hayes's extension. The Admiral answered on the second ring, sounding fully awake despite the early hour. "Hayes." "Admiral, it's Ghost. I need to see you immediately. And you're going to want to bring Captain Morrison and whoever is running the Syrian desk." "That bad?" "Worse. Someone is playing us, and they're very good at it." 20 minutes later, Sarah stood before the same group that had briefed her the day before, plus several additional officers she didn't recognize. The room had the tense atmosphere of people who suspected they were about to hear something they didn't want to know. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, connecting her laptop to the main display, "we have a problem. The intelligence on the Syrian chemical weapons facility is fabricated." The room erupted in controlled chaos. Voices rose in protest, questions, and demands for explanation. Admiral Hayes held up a hand for silence. "Explain," she said simply. Sarah pulled up the communications intercept that had caught her attention. This conversation supposedly took place between 2 Syrian officials discussing the timeline for weapons testing. According to our defector, he recorded this conversation the day before he fled the country. But look at the metadata. She highlighted the timestamp information. This recording was made 6 hours before the defector claims to have recorded it. Either our source can predict the future, or this conversation was manufactured after the fact. Captain Morrison leaned forward, studying the screen. "Could there be an error in the timestamp?" "I thought the same thing, so I checked the other intercepts. Same pattern. All of them show evidence of being created after the events they supposedly document. Someone with sophisticated technical capabilities has been feeding us a carefully constructed false narrative." Sarah pulled up another screen showing satellite imagery analysis. "It gets worse. I had our imagery analysts run a deeper analysis of the facility, those buildings that supposedly house chemical weapons production. They're not connected to the power grid in a way that would support industrial chemical processing. The infrastructure simply isn't there." She clicked to another image. "More importantly, I had them analyze older satellite photos of the same location. This facility has been abandoned for over a year. The increased activity we've been seeing, it's people moving equipment in to make it look operational, not people actually operating a weapons program." The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah could see the implications dawning on faces around the table. Someone had invested significant time and resources in creating an elaborate deception designed to trick the United States into attacking a target in Syria. "Who benefits from this?" Admiral Hayes asked, her voice carefully controlled. Sarah had spent hours thinking about that exact question. Someone who wants the United States to conduct military operations in Syria. Someone with the technical sophistication to create false communications intercepts and the operational capability to stage activity at an abandoned facility. And someone with access to enough intelligence about our procedures to know exactly how to package information in a way we would find credible. "You're talking about a state actor," said one of the officers Sarah didn't recognize. "I'm talking about someone with significant resources and a detailed understanding of American intelligence operations," Sarah replied carefully. "The defector story is particularly sophisticated. They didn't just create false documents. They created a human being with a believable backstory and enough technical knowledge to answer detailed questions about chemical weapons programs." Captain Morrison was scrolling through files on his tablet, his expression growing more concerned with each page. "If you're right, this represents a massive intelligence failure. We've been building an operation based on completely fabricated information." "It's worse than that," Sarah said quietly. "If we had proceeded with the strike, we would have attacked an abandoned facility in Syrian territory. Syria would have every right to claim it was an unprovoked act of war, and whoever orchestrated this would have achieved their goal of drawing the United States into a military confrontation." Admiral Hayes stood and walked to the display, studying the satellite images with new understanding. "Ghost, in your assessment, how long has this operation been in development?" Sarah considered the question. The level of detail and coordination required suggested months of planning. Based on the earliest fabricated communications and the timeline for staging activity at the facility, I'd estimate at least 6 months. This wasn't a rushed operation. Someone has been playing a very long game. "Recommendations?" Admiral Hayes asked. "We need to identify and neutralize the network responsible for this deception before they try again with a different target. We also need to review all intelligence from this region to determine if other operations have been compromised. And we need to have a very uncomfortable conversation about how our security procedures allowed fabricated intelligence to get this far up the chain of command." The room fell into discussion as officers began the process of figuring out how to unravel an operation that had consumed weeks of planning and resources. Sarah watched the conversation with a familiar sense of déjà vu. This was exactly what had happened after Yemen, when the discovery that intelligence was compromised had forced a complete reevaluation of ongoing operations. Admiral Hayes approached Sarah as the meeting began to break up. "Outstanding work, Ghost. You just prevented another potential disaster." "I just did my job, Admiral. The same job I was trying to do 2 years ago." "And you're going to keep doing it," Admiral Hayes said firmly. "I'm recommending your immediate reinstatement to active duty. The Navy needs officers who aren't afraid to challenge consensus when lives are on the line." Sarah felt a mix of emotions she wasn't prepared for. Relief at being vindicated, pride at being wanted again, and fear at the responsibility that came with returning to military service. The simple life she had built serving coffee seemed very far away. "What about my coffee shop?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with the question. Admiral Hayes smiled. "The Navy will find someone to run it while you're deployed. Consider it a strategic asset for maintaining your cover identity." "My cover identity?" "Ghost, you just demonstrated why you're one of the best intelligence analysts in the service. But you also just proved that your civilian identity provides perfect cover for the kind of work we need you to do. A former Navy officer running a coffee shop near a military base? Nobody would suspect that you're still active in intelligence operations." Sarah understood what Admiral Hayes was suggesting. Her coffee shop wouldn't just be a business, it would be a front for intelligence work, a place where she could maintain contact with military personnel while appearing to live a quiet, civilian life. It was an elegant solution to the problem of how to utilize her skills while protecting her identity. "What kind of work are we talking about?" Sarah asked. "The kind where someone needs to ask uncomfortable questions and challenge official narratives. the kind where institutional pressure might prevent active duty officers from speaking up, the kind where we need someone with your specific combination of analytical skills and moral courage. Sarah thought about the past 48 hours, how quickly she had fallen back into the rhythm of intelligence analysis and military decision-making. She thought about the satisfaction of uncovering the truth, even when that truth was uncomfortable for everyone involved. She also thought about 43 children in Yemen who were alive because she had trusted her instincts over her orders. And about whatever disaster might have followed if the United States had attacked Syria based on fabricated intelligence. "When do I start?" Sarah asked. "You already have," Admiral Hayes replied. "Your first assignment is to work with Captain Morrison to identify the network responsible for the Syrian deception. We need to know who did this and why, and we need to make sure they can't do it again." As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave the briefing room, she reflected on the strange path that had brought her back to military service. 2 years ago, she had been forced out for questioning intelligence that turned out to be wrong. Now she was being brought back specifically because she was willing to question intelligence that might be wrong. Captain Morrison approached her as she packed her laptop. "Commander, I owe you an apology. When Admiral Hayes first suggested bringing you in, I thought it was a mistake. I thought your reputation for questioning orders made you a liability." "And now?" Sarah asked. "Now I think questioning orders might be exactly what this service needs," Morrison replied. "I've been in intelligence for 15 years, and I've never seen deception this sophisticated. Without your analysis, we would have walked into exactly the trap someone set for us." Sarah nodded, accepting the apology. She understood Morrison's initial skepticism. Military culture valued following orders and respecting chain of command. Officers who consistently questioned their superiors were often seen as troublemakers rather than assets. "Captain, can I ask you something?" Sarah said as they walked toward the exit. "Of course." "In your 15 years in intelligence, how many times have you seen operations based on information that later turned out to be wrong?" Morrison considered the question carefully. "More often than I'd like to admit. Intelligence is always incomplete, and we're always working with the best information available rather than perfect information. Then why is questioning that intelligence seen as a problem rather than a necessity?" Morrison smiled grimly. "Because questioning intelligence means questioning the people who collected it, analyzed it, and presented it up the chain of command. It means admitting that smart, dedicated people can be wrong. And it means accepting that sometimes the most patriotic thing an officer can do is refuse to follow orders." As Sarah left the Pentagon and stepped into the Washington morning, she felt like she was seeing the world with new eyes. For 2 years, she had believed that her willingness to question orders was a character flaw that had cost her career. Now she understood it was a strength that had made her career possible again. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Your coffee shop is being managed by retired Master Chief Patricia Williams. She knows how to make everything on your menu and has been briefed on your situation. Welcome back to the service, Ghost." Sarah smiled as she hailed a taxi to take her back to San Diego. In a few hours, she would be back at Wings and Beans, but this time as the owner of a legitimate business that also served as cover for intelligence operations. She would be serving coffee to military personnel while secretly working to protect national security. The taxi pulled away from the Pentagon, carrying Sarah back toward her new life as a civilian who wasn't really a civilian, a business owner who was also a military intelligence officer, and a former Navy officer who had been given a second chance to serve her country. As the familiar landmarks of Washington passed by the window, Sarah reflected on the past 3 days and how completely they had changed her life. She had gone from serving coffee and trying to forget her military past to uncovering international deception and preventing a potential war. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Admiral Hayes. First briefing Monday 0800. Dress code is civilian business casual. Your cover identity is more important than military protocol now. Sarah laughed, imagining herself sitting in classified briefings while dressed like a small business owner instead of a military officer. It would take some getting used to, but she was beginning to see the advantages of operating outside the normal military structure. The taxi merged onto I-95 heading south, and Sarah settled back for the long drive to her new life. Behind her was the Pentagon, where she had just prevented a catastrophic intelligence failure. Ahead was her coffee shop, where she would resume serving lattes while secretly serving her country. She thought about the young ensign who had come into her shop just 3 days ago, the one who had thought she looked familiar. Next time he visited Wings and Beans, he would still see a friendly barista who made excellent coffee. He would have no idea that the woman taking his order was Lieutenant Commander Sarah Ghost Martinez, active duty intelligence officer, and one of the few people willing to ask the uncomfortable questions that could prevent wars. As the miles passed, Sarah began planning her return to the coffee shop that was now both her business and her cover. She would need to thank Master Chief Williams for keeping things running, review the books to make sure the business remained profitable, and begin the delicate process of resuming intelligence work while maintaining her civilian identity. It would be a complex life, full of secrets and dual identities and moral complexities. But as the taxi carried her toward San Diego and her new future, Sarah realized she wouldn't have it any other way. She was Ghost again, and she was ready to serve.